if you look into our modern worldview, there is a lot of focus on outer circumstances. There's a lot of emphasis on outer things being in a good condition, and then everything is fine innerly. For example, outerly we must have the best things, we must have the newest things, then everything is good. Or we must go shopping on a shopping spree, and then our inner happiness increases. Of course, I don't assume that any of you are really like that, but you're somewhere in between the ancient view of the Buddha and the modern, maybe materialist view, we could call it. Now, one of his key insights is really that at the core of our inner process of experience, of our emotional experience, there is a basic self-centeredness which is the source of troubles. And this is called avidya, not knowing, or ignorance. This basic self-centeredness, which doesn't realize that we are in truth connected with everything, that in truth everything is deeply inseparable from us. This brings about two fundamental emotions. One is wanting, and the other is not wanting, aversion. These are called raga, which means an intensive wanting, and the other is called dvesha, an intensive not wanting. And this is acceptable by most of you, I assume. However, the Buddha then teaches that these two basic emotions in imbalance lead to further emotions that are not in balance. For instance, when I have excessive liking for myself, but a dislike towards others, this turns into something that can be called pride or superiority, where I somehow emphasize my own value above that of others. And this separates me even more from others. You see, the basic ignorance, the basic self-centeredness is just a fundamental state, whereas pride, emphasizing myself above others, distances me even more from them. And then conversely, when there is an intense dislike or aversion towards myself, a kind of self-hatred or a self-aversion, a self-dislike, but a strong like for what others have, or the status of others, or comparing with others, then this leads to the opposite. It leads to envy or jealousy. These are very subtle analyses if you pay close attention. And Adityaji, who is very good with language and arranging ideas, he came up with a few good terms where there is a low form of dislike, a low form of aversion, which is just not preferring something. That, in a more intense form, means aversion. That turns into dislike. That, even stronger, turns into disgust. That can turn into fear of things or people. that turns into anxiety. So there is like a spectrum of these emotions, but they all come back to the basic emotion of dislike. Similarly, the emotion of like or want has a low form, which is just a basic preference that can turn into desire, that turns into yearning, that turns into strong attachment, that can turn into greed, that can turn into obsession, and finally, there is addiction. Similarly, the emotion of jealousy or envy begins as a basic comparing with others, maybe wanting to be more like them. That turns into low self-esteem. That turns into a feeling of inferiority. That turns into resentment. That can turn into sabotaging oneself, having a sense that we don't deserve good things to happen to us. That turns into self-hatred, and that finally turns into self-harm. And on the side of pride, there is a basic smugness, which one sometimes finds in children, and one finds it in most adults. The Germans say the British have it. The British say the Germans have it. The Swiss say everyone else has it. And everyone else says the Swiss have it. So everyone has this basic smugness a little bit. It's sort of part of our human condition. Only the Japanese don't have it. Otherwise, everyone has it. And that is okay, but that can turn into vanity. And vanity turns into pretentiousness. That turns into a feeling of superiority. That then turns into arrogance. And finally, arrogance turns into self-obsession. Now, in the Buddha's system, all these emotions and their range of the spectrum they have are not just random emotions. They are the source of suffering. You see, the Buddha discovered that inherent to these basic emotions which lead to these other emotional states, inherent to them, innate to them, is the consequence that with time they will lead to dissatisfaction and suffering. Whereas he discovered that the opposite of these emotions, kindness for others, towards others, benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, which we practiced in the retreat, basically connecting to others increases satisfaction, increases joyfulness, and not in some artificial way, rather because we are by nature connected to each and all. The true nature of everyone is the same as our own true nature. Thus, the more we connect to each and all in a benevolent way, in a way that opens up to the others, in a way that reduces the boundaries of duality, reduces the barriers, the more we experience our true nature, which is joyful, which is being at ease. So this is the Buddha Vachana, this is the teaching of the Buddha. You can experiment with it yourself. You don't have to take it at face value, but we will always come back to this basic scheme. And Adityaji created a wonderful slide with this, and I think we will send that to you if that's all right. It's good to see this diagram of emotions that have potential negative effects. Now let's go back to our text. Durangamam ekacharam asariram guhasayam ye chittam samyamissanti mokhanti marabandhana. Those who completely restrain the mind which usually goes far off, wanders about, has no form, they are released from the bondage of suffering. Those who completely restrain the mind, which usually moves far about, wandering about, has no form, they are released from the bondage of suffering. So I want to make it very clear, when he says to restrain the mind, he means to recognize and then with time dissolve these basic negative emotions, these conflictive emotions that have the potential to give rise to dissatisfaction. To again and again recognize them and with time dissolve them means to restrain the mind. Now here there is an interesting story told by the commentator that once there was a man who became a monk, and his name was Sangha Rakkhita. In Sanskrit, this would be Sangha Rakshita. And his sister gave birth to a son and was so impressed by her brother that they named the boy the nephew of Sangha Rakkhita. So Sangha Rakkhita Bhagineya, a really long name. And thus he was also, in short, known as Sangha Rakkhita. And when he came of age, he was admitted into the Buddha's order of monks and nuns. One day, while the young monk was staying at a village, the outskirts of a village, he was offered 2 sets of robes. The monks in India, and you can see it in Sri Lanka and northern Thailand, Thailand in general, Vietnam, all the countries that are influenced by this culture, they wear orange robes. And he thought that he could offer one of the robes to his uncle, who was now already quite elderly. So at the end of the rainy season, during which the monks and nuns never traveled in order not to harm the animals, he went to his uncle and paid his respects to him and offered him the robe. But his uncle declined to accept the robe, saying that he already had enough robes. And the young monk was disheartened by this. He felt that his uncle was not appreciating him, that somehow he was not good enough for him. Now, I hope you are recognizing the emotion that is involved in this story. And this feeling of being disheartened, this feeling of not being appreciated, started nagging in his inner heart. It went deeper and deeper. And at some point, he felt so strongly unappreciated that he even decided to leave the order of the monks and to live an ordinary life. This went through his mind, this idea of leaving the order. So he didn't leave the order. I think I translated wrongly. The idea went through his mind because he was not being appreciated, and his mind started wandering about, and he started imagining how it would be to no longer be a monk. So the train of thoughts followed. He imagined that if he left the order, he could sell the robes, the new robes that he had been gifted. And of all things, he thought he could buy a goat. And that this goat would breed and then give him milk, and he could sell the milk and would have enough money to marry. Now, I don't know if that was ever the case in history, that one could sustain a family with a single goat, but that was his fantasy. And that maybe his wife would then give birth to a son one day, and then he would take his wife and his child in a small cart, paid for through the goat milk, to visit his uncle at the monastery to show, see, I made it in life. Now you see this lack of self-esteem turning into imaginary pride. And in his mind, he thought that on the way there, he could also carry his child and it would be so wonderful. And that his wife then might say, no, I want to carry the child. You drive the cart. And then in his mind, he thought that he would insist that he would carry the child and would drive the cart. So his mind was wandering and imagining things, and then went on and on, imagining this imaginary conflict with a wife that he didn't even have. And then suddenly in his mental image, the child fell from his hands in front of the cart, and the cart went over the child. And he was shocked. My goodness, what could happen? And then his marriage fell apart, and he had to give the goat to the wife. And he was back in the initial position, only that he didn't even have the two robes. So while all this was going on, in reality, he was actually fanning a monk. This was very common in ancient India, that we served the elders by fanning them. And all these ideas were going through his mind, this fantasy story, and he accidentally hit the monk he was fanning with the fan. So this wooden fan, and he hit him on the head accidentally. And those of you who have ever been to a country where this is still the culture, you will know that the older monks actually bless you by hitting you on top of the head with their fan, which is a very interesting custom. I don't know if it has anything to do with this. Tripuraji just shows that we also have a fan, so you can see, but they don't have such exquisite fans as we do. They have more simple ones, but they're very hard. This is not hard. See, if you get this on the head, nothing really happens, but the ones they have are really hard ones. So that will really hurt you. So then the old monk became upset with him and asked him what's going on. And he told him about his worries and his thoughts. And the old monk said that better tell all this to the Buddha. And then the Buddha took this as an example and said, you see, your troubles are all in your mind. It is your sense of inferiority towards your uncle that began this process of thoughts and led to this condition that you are in. That is why the Buddha advised him and all of us to work on our minds rather than the outer situation only. It is our minds that have these basic kleshas. These are the negative emotions and are driven by them. So when we work on these through the antidotes, what are the antidotes? Maitri, karuna, mudita, loving kindness, compassion, joyful appreciation. These are the antidotes to these basic emotions. For instance, if this young monk had practiced mudita for his uncle, he might have appreciated him joyfully for being such a long-time practitioner, such an eminent personality. He might have appreciated him for inspiring his sister and him to become a spiritual practitioner. And he might have ignored that he didn't want to take the robes from him. Moreover, he might have appreciated his humility. He might have thought, how wonderful is he that I'm offering him these new robes, but he doesn't even need them. He's so humble. Maybe I can give the second pair of robes to someone else who is in need. You see, he might have appreciated the situation with mudita, appreciative joy or joyful appreciation. He would have dissolved the sense of envy. And that's called restraining the mind. That when you see in your situation today that there's a subtle envy or there's a subtle sense of inferiority that is actually the source of many emotions you undergo, you can apply the antidote. You can apply mudita. Or when there is a subtle sense of that you think you're something better, then you can apply the antidote of karuna, compassion, empathy. We are all in the same boat. The troubles others go through can visit us anytime. When someone else is weaker than us, we can remember one day we will be, or we might be, in the same situation. Thus, empathy, seeing the situation of the other, gives rise to karuna, gives rise to compassion. And then our own pride, our sense of being superior is reduced. And similarly, maitri can be applied to any group of people where there is some bitterness, where there's some hurt has occurred. And thus brings about a better inner condition. So now, the next verse. Anavattita chittasya sat dhammam avijanato pariplava pasadasya panyana paripurati. Prajna, or wisdom, does not reach fulfillment for one whose mind is not stable, who has not understood true Dharma, and whose serenity fluctuates. Prajna, or wisdom, does not reach fulfillment for one whose mind is not stable, who has not understood true Dharma, and whose serenity fluctuates. When a meditator or a spiritual practitioner fluctuates in their inner serenity, then wisdom cannot attain the degree of clarity required to be stable. For example, a meditator may then theoretically understand that anger or aversion ultimately has a negative consequence for himself and others, but a few hours later, triggered by some outer cause, a wave of anger overcomes him. So that is the fluctuating condition, which simply means that wisdom never reaches fulfillment. Then we are only temporarily wise. If we let outer situations bring back the irritation and anger in us easily, then that is not wisdom. That is just a theory then. When we say anger causes suffering, therefore I have no anger, you see, that is not the way. That is why all this teaching of the Buddha, whatever we are sharing here, is never to be taken as a theory or a kind of attitude, a kind of idea. It is always something that has to be put into practice. We have to recognize the instant the seed of anger rises, the instant a little wave of irritation arises, must be recognized and then harmoniously dissolved, not pushed away. We've talked about this many times. The anger cannot be pushed away, but it can be harmoniously dissolved by applying the meditative practices. And then with time, we see that we truly have less irritation. And that is such a relief. And then naturally, a sense of joyful serenity arises, and that is always a little bit in the background, even when difficult situations come. You see? So now there is another very interesting story, but I will first read the next verse. Anavassuta chittassa ananva hata chetaso punya papa pahinassa natti jagarato bhayam. There is no fear for one who is wakeful, for one whose mind is not leaking with desires, whose mind is not perplexed, and who has transcended both good and bad, which means who is neither attached to the good nor to the bad. There is no fear for one who is wakeful, for one whose mind is not leaking with desires, whose mind is not perplexed, for one who has transcended both good and bad. Yes, so there was a man at Savatthi, which in Sanskrit is Shravasti, and he was looking for his lost ox in the forest. And feeling quite hungry, he went to a village precinct, to the outskirts of a village where there were monks and nuns, and he was given the remains of the morning meal that they had collected in the form of alms and then shared amongst each other. And while taking his food, it occurred to him that even though he worked hard every day, he could not get such good food. and that it might be a good idea to become a monk. It's a great motivation, isn't it? And incidentally, in the monasteries in India and in Thailand as well, I always felt the food is really good, isn't it? It's especially some monasteries, I'm not going to name them, but in some of them, the food is really great. So I think this is a true story. So he asked that he be admitted into the order of monks and nuns. And at this village monastery, he performed the duties of a monk. And as there was plenty of food, he soon gained weight. And that's another phenomenon we find in all the monasteries in India and elsewhere, is that usually the monks and even the nuns are quite podgy. They're quite well fed, even today. And after some time, he felt that this was boring, always sitting and chanting and then sitting quietly and meditating. So he thought that he's going to return to the life of an ordinary person. A few days later, he returned home. And there his wife, of course, was happy that he was back. But she gave him a lot of work to do at the home. And then he felt, oh, that's also too strenuous. And he thought, oh, I'd better go back to the monastery. So he went back to the monastery and he said, oh, I changed my mind. I want to be a monk again. And after a while, his mind again fluctuated. And he thought he'd better go home again. So in this way, 6 times he came back home. And this shuttling process, we could call it, went on because he was only acting according to his whims rather than a deep insight. And unfortunately, while he was going back and forth between his home and the monastery, his wife became pregnant. Now that's usually where all the fun stops, because then there is a duty. So he returned home and he was about to enter the bedroom. He saw that his wife was resting. This is a very funny story, and it's a little mean too. It's really like this in the text. It's not my story. And he heard that she was snoring loudly through her nose and mouth, and saliva was trickling down her mouth. And because her mouth was open and because she was pregnant, she looked really horrible to him, right? So then he was in this situation and he realized that I've been a monk for such a long time, several times, and it's because of this lady that now I have to be here. And this situation sort of brought out the insight in him that the things we achieve in this world are not always permanent, that she was beautiful before, and now to his eyes, she was no longer. And when he thought, I will finally become a monk and I will never go back, the monks at the order said, sorry, we cannot admit you as a monk anymore. because that was the rule of the Buddha, that you have 6 times you can go back to your ordinary life, but after the 6th time, it's over. So he thought, all right, with a deep heart, I mean, with a sort of exhausted heart, he went back home and decided to practice the path of the Buddha while at home, while attending to his duties, while overcoming the laziness in him. And it is said that he attained the level of an arhat. Arhat is someone who really has realized the true nature, even though he was at home, finally. Although he was so wavering before that. I think the message from this story is that you need to observe your wavering mind, and you need to be more resolute when it comes to your spiritual practice. Also, the previous story that described the fantasy, the fantasizing mind, is also very important. Most of the things we fantasize about, especially the fears and the dangers, most of them never come to be the way we fantasized about them. Most of the time, it never turns out like that, both on the good side and the bad side. So the good things, unfortunately, rarely turn out the way we have envisioned them, but also the bad things rarely turn out like that. So come away from fantasizing, come away from mind wandering, bring the mind to the present. Then there is no fear, he said in the next verse. There is no fear for one who is wakeful. Wakeful means who is in the present, who is clear about their purpose, and who is not wandering about in the past or anticipating a future that hasn't arrived and maybe will never arrive. So, if you have any questions, it was a little bit funny today and a little mean, but these are the stories, and I assume that that is how they were told. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, Namaste, Acharya-ji.
Namaste.
I wanted to ask the difference between pushing away an emotion and dissolving it. Yes.
Pushing away means to have the sense, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this. That is actually engaging in one of these emotions. You see, not wanting is one of these emotions that the Buddha taught bring about dissatisfaction. So this is quite a subtle thing. So we have an emotion that we don't want, but then we add the not wanting to that, and we are engaging in the not wanting. You understand? In the aversion towards that emotion. So it is something quite subtle. So instead of realizing, all right, there is this sort of destructive or conflictive, maybe conflictive emotion in me, when I realize there is this conflictive emotion, instead of not wanting it, I can be aware of the emotion. And I can understand through insight that this emotion leads to trouble. You see, that's not the same as instinctively not wanting the emotion. Do you understand the difference between insight into the emotion or simply rejecting the emotion? It's not the same thing.
Yes.
Insight into the emotion means I can be aware of the emotion, clearly aware, knowing this kind of emotion leads to trouble, and I continue to be aware of the emotion until, without pushing it away, it loosens up. I think, Devikaji, you have experienced in meditation before this sudden loosening up of your state, haven't you?
Yes.
What the Buddha taught was to do that again and again and again and again and again and again. Not just once or twice, but to do that again and again till it becomes a natural process. It doesn't mean you won't have emotions. It will just mean that these strong negative emotions or conflictive emotions can no longer attack you, because you instantly recognize them. And then through the recognition, they sort of trickle away as you have experienced before.
Okay, and then if I...
Please.
And then if I then say to myself, I'm bringing in Maitri or Mudita to counteract it, isn't that the same as...
Antidote, yes. Isn't that what, sorry?
The same as saying I don't want it.
It's very subtle. It is very subtle, yes. I agree with you. It can be understood like, I don't want this, yes. It's a difficult one. Maybe the difference is in the intensity. It's in the reaction that you bring about in yourself when you don't want, I don't want this. That's not wisdom. That is just reacting with a klesha, reacting with a negative emotion to another negative emotion. Whereas wisdom means to react with a sense of calmness, with a sense of clarity, knowing this emotion has arisen. This emotion by nature leads to trouble and dissatisfaction. Let me stay with it. Let me recognize the emotion. Now the emotion is becoming less strong. Now the emotion is receding a little. Now I can practice Maitri. Did you see the difference?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Good.
Thank you so much. Dhanyavad.
Thank you. Then, Tusharji, you wanted to ask a question about Thai vegan coconut mango sticky rice?
No, yes, a slightly different one. Sorry, Āchārya. The fantasy mind, right? You mentioned about. We're at that time of year where we all we think of goals and our like aspirations and our and there's a lot of movement around visualizing our outcomes and our goals and thinking really high. And where do we draw the line between that being fantasy and that being us trying to achieve something aspirational? And then how can we, how does that link in with the fear? Because something resonated, but I can't put words to it. The idea of fear, fantasy, and then actually having an aspirational goal and working towards it.
Yeah, it's also a difficult one. Perhaps the measure is the measure of reality and being realistic. So when you're setting a goal, you're consciously trying to bring about a realistic goal. Of course, you have certain benchmarks, you have certain steps that you need to take, but these are mostly within the realm of reality and not just mind wandering and creating illusions. So I think that's perhaps where we need to draw the line. Are these realistic goals? And that gives them energy. When you know that a goal is realistic, that gives you energy to actually pursue it. Isn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
So perhaps coming down to what is realistic, what is doable, what is viable, and the other is the just roaming about in the mind and never taking much action and not paying attention to what you're doing now and what you're engaging in now in the present. You see, I think that's the point the Buddha was addressing here. And that's also the point of the story, exemplified by the young monk then hitting an older monk with the fan by accident. The story simply shows that it's someone not paying attention to their actual current situation, but totally roaming about in the mind only. So can we agree that realistic is the measure? What is realistic?
Yes, I guess it's sort of the benchmarks and having an external kind of benchmark. I mean, it's still a little tricky because when you're sort of in the mind and in that mode of fantasy and aspirational, but I guess it's sort of what one can take action towards to realize is something which is an aspirational goal as opposed to something
and that's
which,
fine,
you know,
that's
I don't
fine,
know.
but you're not fantasizing about that then. You're envisioning. Envisioning is not just fantasizing. Envisioning is all right, but then you take the steps towards that goal. You're not spending the rest of your day or week just fantasizing about it.
Gotcha. Yeah. The karma that we do. Yeah.
And then someone asked, is it easier to become an arhat as a monk than as a householder? This is, of course, an ancient discussion. The ancient view is that it is easier as a monk, and that when you reach a high level of spiritual practice, you should, in fact, renounce the world. This is the ancient view. And I believe that is also the view which current day Buddhists and also Hindu meditators would have. However, it doesn't mean you cannot become an arhat as a householder. And it also doesn't mean you cannot progress spiritually as a householder. But I think we have to be humble and honest and say, we can't, there's a saying in Switzerland, you can't have the 5 francs and the bread, right? So it's sort of either or. It's not exactly like that here, but I think we must be humble and say, yes, if we want to attain very high levels of spiritual realization, we do have to have some renunciation. So clearly, it doesn't mean you can't be a householder, but clearly we need to have dedication. We need to spend time on spiritual practice. We need to do retreats. We need to really go within. And that's not achieved simply by in the morning saying, I quickly need to do my sadhana. Who's written me on my WhatsApp? I'll quickly, yes. Jai Jagadish Hare. Yes. I'll do the puja mentally and I'll quickly send it to the deity when I'm in the car, you know? So that doesn't work. So I think the point here is to say, yes, you can as a householder, but a certain renunciation and a certain commitment is certainly necessary. And then a last question, someone asks, what exactly is the feeling of self-inferiority with respect to the kleshas? Self-inferiority is really when there is actually a deep-set pride. There is a sense that actually we are superior to others, but then that doesn't manifest externally. So let us say we don't become leaders of a country or a company, or we don't have that, we don't have those goals manifesting that our pride projected within our minds. And then that sort of switches over into a sense of inferiority, which is then envy. So what was first pride suddenly switches to envy. It happens very quickly. And then we see, my classmate from school or university is now a doctor in Berlin. Recently, I was Googling, as people often do, one of the names of my classmates, and the person is now a doctor in Berlin. So I can either react with mudita, thinking, yes, I always knew that would be a great profession for them. Yes, they always had this kind nature. They always had this sense they want to help others. Wonderful that they achieved it. Do you see? Or if there is deep pride in me, that will switch into envy. Oh dear, I'm just a Sanskrit teacher. I'm just teaching the Dharmapada, and that person's a doctor. You see? And having neither pride nor envy, of course, doesn't bring about such an emotion, or dissolves it in its seed when it arises, and then transforms it into mudita. So to make the answer more simple, self-inferiority is really an internalization of pride that has become envy, a deep inner state of envy. So please let us be aware of all these ranges of emotions in us and work on transforming our mind through daily awareness practice. Daily doesn't only mean while seated, it can be wherever we are, always connecting to the enlightened beings, knowing that they are our true nature. Thank you very much. Wishing you all the best.
Āchārya, may I ask a quick one?
Yes, please, sir, please.
There seems to be quite a bit of confusion about humanity and spirituality. Some people think they are the same. If you are a good human being, you are a good spiritual being, and others disagree with that. In short, I know time is short, if you could explain, please.
So spirituality is really when we recognize that we have a mind and that this mind is the source of most of our troubles. Whereas humanity, or humanism perhaps, is really manifesting goodness externally, doing a lot of good, seeing the equality of all humans, seeing everyone as brothers and sisters and engaging in that, which is excellent, by the way. So I would say humanity should be the natural consequence of spirituality. It should be the natural consequence. It isn't always, but it should be the natural consequence, because spirituality brings us to a sense of maitri for others, loving kindness for others. So then obviously we want to put that into action. We don't just want to think about it or feel it in our minds or hearts. We want to also put it into action, isn't it? But spirituality is recognizing that while we can do a lot of good externally, we also must take care of our mind. This is the difference. So a spiritual person should ideally be a humanist and take care of their mind. Whereas a humanist is someone who has perhaps not yet discovered the importance of taking care of their mind. Yes?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So the two should go hand in hand.
They should definitely go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Āchārya. Thank you.
Vidyābhāskar, can I ask a very quick question?
All right, but a very quick one. Okay.
Yeah, I think all this could be summed up by one word, which is equanimity. In all circumstances.
Oh yes, you're right, and that's definitely the fourth of the four important practices that were taught. Absolutely, it's called equanimity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wishing you all a good time. See you next time. We will send you the date. Hari Om.